Moscow has issued bomb shelter maps and surged air defences into the capital as 7 more strikes on Wildberries warehouses bring the war home to Russia. President Zelensky's 40-day surge is about to reach its climax. There's been a successful strike on an aircraft plant in occupied Crimea, but Russia has punched back hard, slaying a family of 6 with a North Korean missile, a suspected strike on NATO territory, a mushroom cloud over Khmelnytsky, car bombs in Odessa, and an F-16 down. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. It's been a very big week. I'm going to make sense of it here over the next 20 or so minutes. We're starting with Moscow officials' decisions to issue bomb shelter maps. These are particularly for areas in the southeastern suburbs of the capital. They show hundreds of shelters, cellars beneath buildings. Why have they done this? Well, that's what's important. It's because Ukraine's long-range strikes are getting through to the capital. People are understandably scared. The war has come home to Russia. In the last 7 days, we've seen at least 8 more strikes on Wildberries plants, not just against those around Moscow, across the country, some around 1,000 miles into the country, but nonetheless, it comes with this dramatic footage of Ukrainian drones flying low and fast. This is supposed to be safe territory for Russians. It's supposed to be protected, but Ukraine is proving that it's not. Those strikes on the Wildberries plants range from Sarapul, some 850 miles inside Russian territory, to occupied Crimea, and it follows previous strikes that we talked about last week. These strikes have had 2 important consequences. Number 1, we see that scramble to bolster Moscow's air defences. Now, this has been mapped by a journalist using satellite imagery who works for Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty. He's detected 24 new air defence towers built around the Russian capital over the last 2 months. These are primarily for the Pantsir short-range air defense missiles. You remember we talked about a shortage of those missiles. Russia was facing a crunch point around the beginning of this year. Now, that crunch point may have passed, but the tempo of Ukrainian operations, the fact that they're able to fire so many drones so often, is going to mean that Russia's supplies of those missiles remain very, very stretched, and that may be part of the reason that Ukraine is having so much success in its long-range strikes. The second consequence is a looming banking crisis. Wildberries is Russia's largest online retailer, the answer often described as Russia's answer to Amazon. It is taking a hammering. It also has sort of its own bank as part of the company, but we've heard from Sberbank, which is Russia's largest lender, that risks to online retailers are increasing. It's talked about the level of bad debt on its portfolio increasing, the risk increasing. And we've had the same thing from VTB, which is also a bank. That's the second largest lender in Russia. It's a banking partner of Wildberries. And Wildberries has stopped its loan repayments. So fundamentally, massive company, massive debtor and lender, sort of integral to Russia's financial economic machine, under enormous strain. Also, in the long-range strikes that Ukraine's been carrying out, on the 29th of July, we saw the vast Lukoil oil refinery in Perm struck. That's 1,000 miles inside Russian territory. A weapons plant in Kirov was hit. That's some 760 miles inside Russian territory. And also an oil refinery at Tyumen, a lubricant depot in Rostov, logistics factory in Yekaterinburg. On a slightly different note, in the Caspian Sea, President Zelensky said Ukrainian long-range drones had hit several targets, including a warship, but also cargo vessels transporting military materiel from Iran to Russia. Remember, the Caspian is effectively a huge body of water linking those 2 rogue allies. Tehran has responded with threats that if its vessels or interests are targeted, that it will reply, there will be reprisals against Ukraine. But again, that threat from Tehran, a sign that Ukraine's strikes have made a difference. We've also heard from the Azov Corps that they hit a drone, an anti-tank rather, one of their drones hit an anti-tank mine storage facility in Donetsk. Very dramatic footage of that drone flying into the storage site and then all of these anti-tank mines erupting. And overnight, we've heard from the SBU, Ukraine's domestic intelligence service, that it's hit an aircraft repair plant in Yevpatoria in Crimea. It's also hit the port in Taman on the Russian side of the Kerch Strait. All of this is about the tempo of operations. That's become really important to Ukraine. It's not just about hitting important targets, it's about hitting them regularly and at a pace where they inflict damage faster than Russia is able to repair it. And that's not necessarily anything new. Russia is also trying to do that in reply. In order to make that successful, we've heard from the Ukrainians that they're being very precise about what they target. So it's not necessarily just about blowing up a fuel depot. It might be about destroying certain valves or parts on that depot or that refinery or that ammunition factory, the parts that are hardest to repair and hardest to replace, because that means that the damage lasts longer, costs more. Russia has, however, really hit back this week. There have been some 1,274 missiles and drones fired at targets across Ukraine in the last 7 days, and indeed one of those missiles hit Polish territory, is thought to have hit Polish territory. I'll come to that in a minute. There are 4 big incidents I'm going to look at now. On the 24th of July, 10 people were killed when an arms fair, a meeting of the Ukraine Council for Defence Industries, was hit on the highway to Zhytomyr. Now, this was an event that had been publicly advertised. So a lot of criticism after those strikes that perhaps people were endangered by a lack of sort of operational security around that event. Reports of several explosions, several missiles hitting a facility in a daytime strike. On the 30th of July, so more recently, 6 people from a single family of 9 were killed in Radushny, that's near Kryvyi Rih, President Zelensky's hometown. And Zelensky's come out just moments ago saying that the missile that caused those deaths was in all likelihood a North Korean missile. And that's significant. It potentially shows us 2 things. The first thing is that Russia, once again, forced to lean on allies for weapons. It's been using Iranian-made Shahed drones almost since day one of the war. It has fired North Korean KN-23 missiles in the past, but there's been a break. So that could mean 2 things, either that North Korea has ramped up production and has a surplus it's willing to sell, or perhaps also that Russia is exhausting its own stockpiles and needs to lean more heavily on Pyongyang. Now, these missiles, the KN-23, they're very similar to the Iskander ground-launched ballistic missiles. These are big weapons, 7.5 meters long. They weigh about 3.5 tons. They have a range of some 500 kilometers. The Iskanders and the KN-23s, the ballistic missiles, are also among the hardest for Ukraine to shoot down because of the speed at which they fly. Also, that same night, a suspected Russian air-launched cruise missile, suspected KH-101, flew into Polish airspace, exploded 57 miles inside Polish territory. That's NATO territory. The Polish leader saying it is almost certainly a Russian weapon. They haven't confirmed it categorically. It hit near the village of Tarnowa Kolonia, creating a 33-foot wide crater. That was likely, we believe, a KH-101. Now, that's an air-launched cruise missile, so it has a much longer range, about 2,800 kilometers, because it's launched from high up, but it flies more slowly. Similarly, about 7.5 meters long, and it can carry a payload of nearly half a ton, about 450 kilograms of explosives. We've also seen this morning dramatic footage of a vast mushroom cloud billowing over Khmelnytsky in central Ukraine. Reports that explosions there lasted for over 1 hour. And whilst Ukraine hasn't commented, understandably, on what's been hit, the indications are that there are secondary explosions that would suggest perhaps that this is a successful strike on an ammunition dump or depot of some kind. This echoes of very, very similar circumstances I remember in 2023. So staggering that it was that long ago, 3 years ago, but a vast mushroom cloud billowing over the same area. These secondary explosions blowing out windows in nearby homes. So Russia may have been targeting the same facility or another facility or a similar facility. I'm speculating there. And finally, just want to mention something else that Russia appears to be targeting more frequently, which is Nova Pochta. That is Ukraine, one of Ukraine's postal services. There were 3 killed in a strike on a Nova Pochta depot in Sumy. 1 person killed in a Nova Pochta facility in Poltava, and also reports that a facility hit in Izium as well. So just as perhaps we've seen Ukraine targeting Russian logistics with those strikes on Wildberries, so Russia is hitting back with strikes on Ukraine's postal services. We've also seen them in the past hitting the railways. And there has been, in the last couple of weeks, footage of these epicenter stores on fire. Epicenter is sort of vast, large retail chain, usually found in the kind of commercial parks on the edges of cities, that sells everything sort of DIY store plus, and everything from clothes to paints to tools to garden furniture. There have also been this week 2 car bombs in Odessa on the same day. One in the courtyard of a building, apparently targeting a Ukrainian serviceman. The second targeting an individual believed to have worked for the Ministry of Interior, but who retired about 12 years ago. What's interesting is that this is a reminder of that sort of other type of campaign going on in the background, where it's not just about what's happening in the very, very deep. It's not just about what's happening in the trenches, but these kind of like guerrilla style attempted and sometimes successful assassinations, both sides doing them using different techniques. Russia in the past has tended to hire thugs, often through things like Telegram. And we've seen a bit of that modus operandi playing out in other countries as well. In Poland, where there have been arson attacks. In this country, where there have been arson attacks against a house previously used by the previous Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. In other news, in the old war, as I like to call it, there is an F-16 down. A Ukrainian F-16 has crashed. This was reportedly an in-flight emergency, so that would suggest some kind of technical malfunction. The pilot did manage to eject. This is the 5th F-16 that Ukraine has lost in the last 2 years. They entered combat service in August 2024. 3 allies, Norway, Denmark and the Netherlands, have between them pledged 57 aircraft, of which about 50 we know have been delivered. 5 have crashed. 3 were fatal. 3 of the pilots were killed in those crashes. On 2 occasions, they managed to eject and survived. In that close battle as well, Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainian town just west of Bakhmut, has finally fallen to Russian hands. I have to say, when I heard that, I was actually surprised that Ukrainian forces had held on there for so long, because the battle for Bakhmut feels a bit like ancient history. And Chasiv Yar, a much smaller settlement on the high ground just to the west of it, where Ukraine has managed to hang on for years. But Russia is pushing relentlessly forward, slowly but relentlessly. And as they take Chasiv Yar, that will inevitably become a staging post for attacks further west into Donetsk. They're also fighting hard in Slovyansk, in Dobropilya, which is in that same area. Ukraine fighting back, pushing back in Liman. There were suggestions that were debunked last week that Russian soldiers might be getting encircled, but nonetheless, Ukraine appears to be making some advances there. On the political front, President Donald Trump appears to have gone wobbly on his promise to let Ukraine manufacture Patriot air defense systems under license. This was a pledge that the US president made the last time he met President Zelensky, and it was significant because those Patriot air defense systems are the most advanced air defense weapons in Ukraine's arsenal. They are the best at shooting down Russia's fastest and often most devastating missiles, things like the Kinzhals, the Zircons, and indeed the Iskander-M ballistic missiles, and potentially also those KN-23 or 24 North Korean missiles, if indeed that's what North Korea has supplied. It was a promise. It was always going to be intensely technical and difficult to get those licenses. There will be a lot of sensitive American technology in those systems. Trump appears to have rowed back. So that's disappointing for Ukraine. But if we know anything about Trump, it's that he changes his mind regularly and severally. So that may yet happen for Ukraine. Also in America and on American politics, the late Senator Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill has moved one step closer through the Senate, where it was approved in a sort of symbolic vote, but with almost overwhelming support, 86 votes to 12. Now this sanctions package, if it goes through, would impose 100% secondary tariffs on countries that are buying Russian oil. So the Russian oil can be sanctioned, but countries, for example, like India and others who buy it, effectively enrich themselves by buying this cheap oil, often processing it and selling it on, would be hit with enormously punitive sanctions. And that might force them to decide to do less business with Russia. And in turn, that would pass the financial pain on to Moscow. As ever, if you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. We love reading them. We get through loads of them. They make us laugh. They make us think. And what I'm saying is also, if you are watching Frontline, if you like Frontline, then please do subscribe to the Sun's channel. Let us know what you like in the comments. Let us know if you'd like to see more of something else. We do read them. We do get back to you. We do respond to them. Question number 1. When will Putin say enough is enough? We get versions of this question a lot, but I think it's really important because fundamentally, Putin is the person who decides how long this war lasts. He waged this war. It was a war of choice. He is the only person really at the moment who has the power to stop it immediately if he were to give the order to Russian forces to withdraw. Ukraine is trying to stop it. Ukraine is trying to heap pressure on Putin, heap pressure on Russia's armed forces, heap pressure on its economy and its industry. The scale of Russian suffering and Russian losses over the course of the last 4.5 years is staggering. But we haven't seen any indications yet that it is changing Vladimir Putin's calculus. So this really is the million-dollar question. I was reminded, though, of a quote from a Hemingway book, The Sun Also Rises, about how one of the characters went bankrupt. And he said, 2 ways, slowly and then suddenly. And I think that's probably how we'll see Vladimir Putin, his position change. When it does happen, it will likely happen very suddenly. Question number 2. Is the smoke that we see billowing out of these strikes, the oil refineries, the Wildberries plants, is that a crime against the environment? I think it's fair to say, yes, it is. There is a terrible environmental toll from this conflict. And most obviously, at the moment, from the thick plumes of black smoke we see billowing over Moscow, over oil refineries, indeed today, the mushroom cloud billowing over central Ukraine. Without doubt, there was some research published last year that suggested that Ukraine's carbon emissions had soared about 30% since the war began. And that's just inside Ukraine. That wasn't measuring what's happening as Russia burns, or indeed the emissions due to Russia's own activity in this war, sort of just fueling and funding its armed forces. So yes, it's appalling. It's often heartbreaking to see that, especially when you compare that to where we are with threats like global warming and carbon emissions. But important when you consider that to just go back to why this is happening. This is as a consequence of Russia's invasion. It is a consequence of Russia and of Putin waging that war of choice. Final question. We haven't heard a lot about North Korean troops. Are they going to rejoin the fight? There are reports. Ukraine has warned that some 30,000 North Koreans may be deployed to Russia. The suggestion at the moment is those soldiers would stay in Russia, although that could change. It's worth remembering that a couple of years ago, 11,000 North Korean soldiers were deployed and they did fight Ukraine in occupied Russian Kursk. So this was after Moscow and Pyongyang, Kim and Putin signed a sort of military partnership, and that enabled the North Koreans, or it provided, I should say, really a fig leaf of cover for the North Koreans to go and fight in Russia against Ukraine. They suffered pretty high casualties. About 30% of the soldiers who deployed were reportedly killed, according to an analysis an open source and satellite analysis by the BBC. So they paid an enormous price. Suggestions that 30,000 more troops may be about to deploy, unclear if they'll fight. And of course, we've already discussed in this episode the presence of a North Korean missile on the battlefield after many, many months where we haven't seen those weapons in action. As ever, thank you very much for watching Frontline. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. Do like and subscribe and comment. If you'd like to follow more of my work on defence, then you can reach me at Jerome Starkey on Twitter and Instagram. See you next time.